dear companions of the night, to another gentle journey through the quieter corners of history. Whether you find yourself nestled in bed as the evening settles around you, or perhaps listening during a peaceful moment stolen from the day's demands, I'm delighted to have you here once again. Do share with me where in this wide world you're listening from. I like to imagine our little community scattered across time zones, united by curiosity and the comfort of stories well told. And if these historical wanderings bring you a measure of peace, please do consider subscribing. There are so many more tales waiting to be shared tonight. We travel not to windswept islands or industrial cities, but to a place where cobblestones echoed with the rhythm of inexplicable feet, where the very air seemed to pulse with an ancient, mysterious music that only some could hear. Our destination is the city of Strasbourg, in the Holy Roman Empire, during the sweltering summer of 1518, when the impossible became commonplace, and the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds seemed to dissolve like morning mist. Our story begins not with fanfare or catastrophe, but with the simple sight of a woman dancing alone in the narrow street outside her home. Her name was Frau Troffea, and on this particular July morning, she had stepped from her doorway into the dusty street and begun to move her feet in patterns that seemed to follow music only she could hear. The sun was already climbing toward its peak, promising another day of oppressive heat that had settled over Strasbourg like a heavy blanket, making every breath an effort and every movement a burden. But Frau Troffea moved as if the heat meant nothing to her, as if some force more powerful than the summer sun was compelling her steps. Her movements were not the graceful, measured steps of a court dance, nor the exuberant leaps of a village celebration. They were something else entirely, urgent, compulsive, driven by a rhythm that seemed to come from deep within her bones. The neighbors who first noticed her assumed she was celebrating some private joy, perhaps news from a distant relative, or the successful completion of some long-awaited task. Strasbourg was a prosperous city, a crossroads of trade where good news was as common as the merchant caravans that passed through its gates, and spontaneous celebration was not unknown in its streets. But as the morning wore on and Frau Troffea continued her solitary dance, moving from one end of the narrow street to the other with steps that never faltered, the neighbors began to whisper among themselves. They watched from their windows and doorways as she spun and stepped, her arms moving in gestures that seemed to respond to commands they could not hear, her face bearing an expression of intense concentration, as if she was listening to something infinitely important and beautiful. Frau Troffea was not a young woman. She had passed her 40th year, had raised children, had buried a husband, had known the weight of responsibility and the ache of loss that marked the lives of working people in the 16th century. She was known in her neighborhood as a practical woman, one who managed her small household with careful economy and helped her neighbors in times of need. She was not given to flights of fancy or dramatic gestures, Yet here she was, moving through the dust of the street with an energy that seemed inexhaustible, her feet finding rhythms that grew more complex as the hours passed. By midday, when the heat should have driven any sensible person indoors to seek shade and rest, Frau Troffea was still dancing, her clothes now damp with perspiration, her breath coming in short gasps, but her feet never pausing in their mysterious choreography. The neighborhood children were the first to gather around her, fascinated by this unprecedented display. They clapped their hands and tried to match her steps, laughing at their own clumsy attempts to follow patterns they couldn't understand. But as the afternoon wore on, even the children grew quiet, sensing that what they were witnessing was something beyond ordinary celebration or play. By evening, when the church bells rang vespers and the working day officially ended, a small crowd had gathered to watch Frau Troffea's endless dance. The local baker, Johann Zimmermann, later wrote in his journal that the woman's face had taken on an expression of rapture mixed with exhaustion, as if she was experiencing something wonderful and terrible at the same time. She danced as one possessed, Zimmermann recorded, but not by any demon that I could recognize. Rather, it seemed as if the very music of the spheres had descended into her body and was using her as its instrument. Her movements were beautiful and terrifying to behold, for they spoke of forces beyond our common understanding. As night fell and torches were lit in the street, Frau Troffea showed no signs of stopping. Her family pleaded with her to come inside to rest, to explain what had come over her, but she seemed unable to hear their words. When they tried to physically restrain her, she struggled against them with surprising strength, her body continuing its rhythmic motions even as they held her arms. The local priest, Father Heinrich Müller, was summoned to examine the woman and determine whether she was suffering from some kind of spiritual affliction. Father Müller was a learned man who had studied at the University of Paris and had encountered many unusual conditions during his years of ministry. He observed Frau Troffea carefully, noting that her eyes remained clear and aware, that she responded to questions with nods and gestures, even though she could not seem to stop her dancing long enough to speak. This is not demonic possession, Father Müller pronounced after his examination. The woman shows none of the signs we would expect from such an affliction. Rather, it appears that she is compelled to dance by some force that, while beyond our understanding, is not necessarily evil in nature. The priest's pronouncement calmed some fears, but raised new questions. If Frau Troffea was not possessed by demons, what force was compelling her endless dance? And more troubling, why did she seem unable or unwilling to stop? These questions became more pressing as the night wore on. Frau Troffea continued to dance by torchlight, her movements growing more elaborate and strange as exhaustion should have claimed her. Those who watched reported that she seemed to be responding to music that grew more complex and beautiful as the hours passed. Music that only she could hear, but that somehow communicated itself to the observers through the grace and precision of her steps. By dawn of the second day, Frau Troffea had been dancing for nearly 24 hours without pause. She had accepted no food or water, had not rested even for a moment, yet she showed no signs of collapse. If anything, her dancing seemed to have grown more energetic and joyful as the night progressed, as if the mysterious force that compelled her was growing stronger rather than weaker. It was then that the first of her neighbors joined her, Herr Klaus Faber, a leather worker whose shop stood at the corner of the street. Later told his confessor that he had been watching Frau Troffea's dance since the previous morning, initially with amusement, then with concern, and finally with a kind of longing he couldn't explain. I found myself listening for the music she was hearing, Faber recounted. At first, there was only silence, but as I watched her movements more carefully, I began to sense the rhythm she was following. And then, gradually, I began to hear it too, not with my ears, but with something deeper, something that resonated in my very soul. Faber described the music as unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not the familiar melodies of church hymns or tavern songs, but something ancient and eternal, something that seemed to connect the listener to rhythms that predated human civilization. It was the music of creation itself, he said, the rhythm that underlies all existence, the beat that keeps the stars in their courses and the seasons in their cycle. Once I heard it, I could not resist its call. And so, on the morning of the second day, Klaus Faber stepped into the street and began to dance alongside Frau Troffea. His movements were different from hers, more angular and vigorous, reflecting his masculine nature and his trade as a craftsman. But they clearly followed the same invisible conductor, responded to the same unheard music. The sight of two people dancing in perfect synchronization to music that existed only in their minds was more unsettling to the neighbors than Frau Troffea's solitary performance had been. It suggested that whatever was affecting her might be contagious, that the strange compulsion might spread to others. These fears proved to be well-founded. By the end of the second day, 4 more people had joined the dance. A young mother named Else Gerber, an elderly grain merchant called Wilhelm Koch, an apprentice carpenter named Thomas Mueller, no relation to the priest, and a widow named Margaret Weber, who was known throughout the neighborhood for her piety and sobriety. Each of them later described a similar experience. First watching the dancers with curiosity, then with fascination, then with a growing sense of longing, until finally they could no longer resist the pull of the unheard music. They spoke of feeling as if they had been summoned by something greater than themselves, called to participate in a dance that was both celebration and worship, both individual expression and collective ritual. The 6 dancers moved together in the street with a coordination that was both beautiful and eerie. They never collided with one another, never missed a step, never fell out of rhythm with the music that only they could hear. Observers noted that their faces bore expressions of profound joy mixed with exhaustion, as if they were experiencing something wonderful that was also beyond their strength to sustain. Word of the strange events in Strasbourg began to spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Merchants carried stories to other parts of the city. Traveling scholars wrote letters to colleagues in distant universities, and priests sent reports to their bishops describing the unprecedented phenomenon they were witnessing. The city authorities were initially inclined to treat the matter as a minor disturbance that would resolve itself once the participants grew tired or came to their senses. Strasbourg had experienced its share of religious enthusiasm and popular movements over the centuries, and the officials assumed this was another temporary outbreak of mass hysteria that would burn itself out within a few days. But as more people joined the dance, and the participants showed no signs of stopping, the authorities began to take the situation more seriously. By the end of the first week, more than 30 people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg, and new dancers were joining the group every day. The dancers came from all walks of life: merchants and craftsmen, housewives and servants, young people and old, the pious and the worldly. What they had in common was not social class or religious fervor, but their description of hearing irresistible music that compelled them to move in harmony with forces beyond their understanding. Dr. Johann Jailer von Kaysersberg, one of Strasbourg's most learned physicians, was called in to examine the dancers and determine whether they were suffering from some kind of medical condition. Dr. Jailer was a graduate of the renowned medical school at Montpellier and had studied the latest theories about the relationship between physical and mental health. His examination of the dancers revealed several puzzling findings. Despite having danced for days without apparent rest, they showed no signs of serious physical exhaustion. Their pulse rates were elevated but stable. Their breathing was rapid but regular, and they seemed to be in a state of physical fitness that was actually better than normal for people their age and social condition. More puzzling still, the dancers appeared to be sustaining themselves on the act of dancing itself. They consumed very little food or water, yet they showed no signs of dehydration or malnutrition. When forced to pause briefly for examination, they became agitated and uncomfortable, as if separation from the dance caused them physical pain. It is as if the dancing provides them with some form of sustenance that we do not understand, Dr. Jailer reported to the city council. They seem to draw energy from the very activity that should exhaust them, to find nourishment in movement itself. Physicians' report deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. If the dancers were not suffering from illness or malnutrition, what was sustaining their extraordinary endurance? And what was the source of the compulsion that drove them to continue their endless performance? These questions became more urgent as the number of dancers continued to grow. By the middle of July, more than 100 people were participating in what had come to be called the dancing plague of Strasbourg. The narrow street where Frau Troffea had begun her solitary dance could no longer contain them all, and they had spread to the main market square in the center of the city. The sight of 100 people dancing in perfect synchronization to music that existed only in their minds was both magnificent and terrifying. Visitors to Strasbourg reported that the dancers moved like a single organism, their individual movements combining to create patterns of extraordinary beauty and complexity. The dance seemed to have its own logic and structure, with different groups of dancers performing different movements that complemented and enhanced each other. Jakob Wimpfeling, a humanist scholar who witnessed the phenomenon, wrote in his diary, "I have seen the greatest artists of our time perform in the courts of princes, but nothing I have witnessed compares to the unconscious artistry of these common people as they move in harmony with forces that surpass human understanding. Their dance is a living prayer, a physical manifestation of the music that underlies all creation." But Wimpfeling also noted the darker aspects of what he observed. Yet, there is something troubling about their joy, something desperate in their ecstasy. They dance as if their very souls depend on it, as if stopping would mean not merely exhaustion, but spiritual death. What force has claimed them so completely that they cannot rest even for a moment? The city authorities were faced with an unprecedented crisis. The dancers were disrupting commerce and daily life, drawing crowds of curious onlookers who clogged the streets and interfered with normal activities. More seriously, the phenomenon seemed to be spreading, with new dancers joining the group every day despite official attempts to discourage participation. Magistrate Johann von Zabern called a meeting of the city council to determine how to respond to the crisis. The council included representatives of the various guilds, church officials, and learned men from the local university. Their deliberations revealed deep disagreements about the nature of the phenomenon and the appropriate response to it. Some council members argued that the dancing was a form of religious enthusiasm that should be suppressed as a threat to public order. They pointed to historical examples of mass hysteria and religious mania that had caused social disruption and economic damage. They recommended arresting the dancers and confining them until the compulsion passed. Others contended that the dancing might be a genuine spiritual phenomenon that deserved respect and protection. They noted that the dancers showed no signs of the violence or destructive behavior typically associated with religious fanaticism, and they argued that suppressing what might be a divine manifestation could bring God's wrath upon the city. A third faction proposed a medical approach, arguing that the dancers were suffering from a previously unknown disease that required treatment rather than punishment. They recommended consulting with the most learned physicians available and attempting to develop a cure for the mysterious ailment. The debate continued for several days, while the number of dancers continued to grow. By the end of July, city officials estimated that more than 400 people were participating in the dance, representing nearly 10% of Strasbourg's population. The phenomenon was no longer a curious local disturbance, but a major crisis that threatened the social and economic stability of the entire city. It was at this point that the council decided to consult with the most learned experts available. not just local physicians and priests, but scholars from the great universities of Paris and Vienna, who might have encountered similar phenomena in their studies of natural philosophy and divine mysteries. Dr. Paracelsus, the famous Swiss physician and alchemist, was among those who traveled to Strasbourg to observe the dancing plague. Paracelsus was known throughout Europe for his unconventional theories about the relationship between physical and spiritual health, and he brought a unique perspective to the mystery. After observing the dancers for several days, Paracelsus proposed that they were experiencing what he called a sympathetic resonance with cosmic forces that normally remained hidden from human perception. He theorized that certain individuals, under specific conditions, might become sensitive to the underlying rhythms that governed the movement of celestial bodies and the flow of spiritual energy through the material world. These people have become instruments, Paracelsus explained to the city council, tuned to frequencies that exist beyond the range of normal human perception. They dance not because they choose to, but because they have become conduits for forces that are both natural and supernatural, both physical and metaphysical. Paracelsus's theory was intriguing, but offered little practical guidance for dealing with the crisis. If the dancers were indeed responding to cosmic forces, how could mere human authority hope to control or redirect their behavior? The answer, according to Paracelsus, lay not in opposing the dance, but in understanding its purpose and allowing it to reach its natural completion. He argued that the phenomenon was self-limiting, that it would eventually exhaust itself once whatever cosmic alignment or spiritual purpose it served had been fulfilled. Fighting against such forces is like trying to stop the tide or silence the wind, Paracelsus advised. Better to protect the dancers from harm while allowing the phenomenon to run its course naturally. This advice was difficult for the city authorities to accept, as it essentially meant acknowledging their powerlessness to control the situation. But as conventional approaches proved ineffective and the number of dancers continued to grow, the council began to consider more radical responses. One proposal that gained significant support was to provide formal accommodation for the dancers rather than trying to suppress them. If the phenomenon was indeed beyond human control, perhaps the city's responsibility was to ensure the dancers' safety and minimize the disruption to normal life rather than trying to end the dancing itself. Acting on this principle, the council arranged for the construction of temporary stages in several public squares, giving the dancers dedicated spaces where they could perform without blocking traffic or interfering with commerce. They also organized teams of volunteers to provide the dancers with water and light foods, since many seemed unable to stop dancing long enough to eat proper meals. These accommodations had mixed results. The dancers eagerly used the provided stages, and their performances became more elaborate and spectacular when they had adequate space to move. The volunteer caregivers reported that the dancers seemed grateful for the assistance. though they remained unable to speak coherently while under the compulsion to dance. But the provision of official support for the dancing also seemed to legitimize the phenomenon in the minds of potential new participants, rather than discouraging people from joining the dance. The city's accommodating response appeared to encourage more people to surrender to whatever force was compelling the movement. By early August, the number of active dancers had reached nearly 600, and they had organized themselves into groups that performed different styles of dance in various locations throughout the city. Some groups favored slow, meditative movements that suggested prayer or contemplation. Others performed vigorous, athletic dances that required extraordinary physical endurance. Still others engaged in complex group choreographies that seemed to tell stories or enact rituals whose meaning was lost to observers. The diversity of dancing styles suggested that the phenomenon was not a simple case of mass imitation, but something more complex, as if different people were responding to different aspects of the same underlying force, each finding their own way to participate in whatever cosmic event was unfolding in Strasbourg. Dr. Agrippa von Nettesheim, a renowned scholar of occult philosophy, arrived in Strasbourg in early August to study the phenomenon. Dr. Agrippa was known throughout Europe for his research into the hidden connections between earthly events and celestial influences, and he brought sophisticated theories about astrology and natural magic to bear on the mystery. Agrippa's investigation focused on the timing and location of the dancing outbreak. He noted that the phenomenon had begun during a particular configuration of planets that, according to ancient astrological texts, was associated with the opening of channels between the material and spiritual worlds. He also observed that Strasbourg's location at the intersection of major trade routes might make it particularly sensitive to the flow of spiritual as well as commercial energies. This city sits at a convergence point, Agrippa explained in a letter to a colleague, where currents of power meet and amplify each other. The dancers have become sensitive to these currents, and their movements serve to channel and harmonize the spiritual forces that are flowing through this place. Agrippa's theory suggested that the dancing plague was not a random outbreak of mass hysteria, but a response to specific spiritual conditions that might not occur again for centuries. This interpretation gave the phenomenon a cosmic significance that elevated it from a local curiosity to an event of universal importance. But Agrippa's theories also implied that the dancing would continue until the underlying spiritual conditions changed, which might take weeks, months, or even years. This prospect was deeply troubling to city officials who were already struggling to manage the social and economic disruptions caused by having such a large portion of the population engaged in continuous dancing. The pressure on the city's resources was becoming severe. The dancers required constant supervision to ensure their safety, and many of their family members had abandoned their normal occupations to care for their dancing relatives. Commerce was disrupted as customers and merchants gathered to watch the performances rather than conducting business. The city's reputation was beginning to suffer as stories of the dancing plague spread throughout Europe, with some foreign merchants avoiding Strasbourg entirely for fear of being caught up in whatever madness had claimed its people. It was at this critical juncture that an unexpected solution emerged from an unlikely source. Sister Adelheid von Zimmern, the abbess of a small convent near Strasbourg, arrived in the city claiming to have received divine guidance about how to end the dancing plague. Sister Adelheid was known throughout the region as a woman of exceptional piety and wisdom. She had spent 30 years in religious life, much of it in solitary contemplation and prayer, and she was respected by both church authorities and common people for her spiritual insights and practical wisdom. The abbess had been following reports of the dancing plague with deep interest, recognizing in the phenomenon something that resonated with her own experiences of divine ecstasy and mystical union. She believed that the dancers were indeed responding to spiritual forces, but that they had become trapped in an incomplete understanding of what those forces required of them. They dance because they hear the music of heaven, Sister Adelheid explained to the city council, but they cannot hear the silence that follows, the rest that completes the rhythm. They have learned the first movement of a cosmic symphony, but not the final resolution that brings peace. Abbess proposed a radical solution. Rather than trying to stop the dancing, she would teach the dancers to dance themselves into the very silence they sought, using techniques of contemplative prayer and mystical practice that she had learned during her years of religious life. She would guide the dancers through the complete spiritual journey that their bodies had already begun. The city council was initially skeptical of Sister Adelheid's proposal. Her mystical approach seemed even more radical than the scholarly theories of Paracelsus and Agrippa, but conventional solutions had proved completely ineffective, and the abbess's reputation for wisdom and piety gave weight to her unusual recommendations. After much deliberation, the council agreed to allow Sister Adelheid to attempt her intervention, on the condition that she work only with volunteers, and that her activities be carefully supervised by both medical and religious authorities. Sister Adelheid began her work with a small group of dancers who had been among the first to join Frau Troffea's original dance. She observed their movements carefully, learning to recognize the rhythms they followed and the spiritual states those rhythms reflected. Then, gradually, she began to introduce subtle modifications to their dancing, moments of stillness, changes in tempo, movements that led naturally toward rest rather than continued motion. The process was delicate and time-consuming. The dancers resisted any attempt to interrupt their compulsive movement, becoming agitated and distressed when encouraged to pause or slow down. But Sister Adelheid persisted, using techniques of spiritual guidance that she had developed during decades of helping others navigate the complexities of mystical experience. Slowly, over the course of several weeks, she was able to guide individual dancers toward moments of stillness that gradually lengthened into periods of rest. As each dancer learned to find peace within the rhythm that had once compelled them, they were able to step back from the compulsive movement and return to normal life. The success of Sister Adelhaide's approach with the initial group of volunteers led to its expansion to other dancers. Teams of trained assistants, working under the abbess's guidance, began the painstaking process of helping hundreds of people learn to complete the spiritual journey their bodies had begun. The work continued throughout the autumn of 1518, with new dancers sometimes joining the plague, even as others were guided toward recovery. But gradually, the balance shifted, and the number of active dancers began to decline for the first time since the phenomenon had begun by winter. Only a small core group of dancers remained, mostly those who had been among the very first to join the plague. These individuals seemed most deeply affected by whatever force had initiated the phenomenon, and they required the most intensive and prolonged intervention. Frau Troffea, the woman whose solitary dance had started the entire episode, was among the last to find release from the compulsion that had claimed her. Sister Adelhaide worked with her personally, spending hours each day helping her navigate the spiritual terrain that had opened before her on that July morning when she had first heard the cosmic music on the winter solstice of 1518, exactly 6 months after the dancing plague had begun. Frau Troffea finally achieved the stillness that had eluded her for so long. Sister Adelhaide later described the moment as one of profound beauty and peace, as the woman who had danced for half a year finally heard the silence that completed the music she had been following. With Frau Troffea's recovery, the dancing plague of Strasbourg officially came to an end. The last of the dancers had found their way to the stillness that had always been the true goal of their endless movement, and the city could begin to return to normal life. But the impact of the dancing plague extended far beyond the immediate crisis it had created. The phenomenon had touched the lives of hundreds of people directly, and thousands more indirectly, creating ripples of change that would be felt for generations to come. Many of those who had participated in the dancing reported that the experience had fundamentally changed their understanding of themselves and their relationship to the divine. They spoke of having touched something eternal and beautiful during their months of compulsive movement, something that remained with them even after the dancing had ended. Dr. Johann Jailer, the physician who had studied the dancers, found that many showed lasting improvements in their physical health and vitality. The intense physical activity had strengthened their bodies, but more than that, they seemed to have discovered reserves of energy and resilience that they had never known they possessed. The spiritual effects were even more profound. Many former dancers reported enhanced sensitivity to beauty, increased capacity for prayer and contemplation, and a deeper understanding of the mystical dimensions of religious faith. Some joined religious communities, while others found ways to integrate their spiritual insights into their daily lives as merchants, craftsmen, and housekeepers. The dancing plague also had broader cultural impacts that extended throughout the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Scholars from across Europe came to study the phenomenon, leading to new theories about the relationship between individual and collective consciousness, between physical and spiritual health, and between human behavior and cosmic forces. The event challenged conventional understanding of mass hysteria and religious enthusiasm, suggesting that such phenomena might be more complex and meaningful than previously thought. It contributed to growing interest in mystical spirituality and in techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness through physical movement and spiritual discipline. Artists and writers found inspiration in the story of the dancing plague, creating works that explored themes of divine compulsion, collective ecstasy, and the search for transcendence through physical expression. These artistic interpretations helped preserve the memory of the phenomenon and ensure that its lessons would be transmitted to future generations. The city of Strasbourg itself was permanently changed by the experience. The authorities had learned important lessons about managing unusual crises and about the limits of conventional approaches to problems that transcended normal categories of understanding. They had also discovered the value of seeking wisdom from unconventional sources and of remaining open to solutions that challenged established assumptions. Sister Adelhaide's success in resolving the dancing plague enhanced her reputation and led to her being consulted on similar phenomena throughout Europe. She developed systematic approaches to helping people navigate mystical experiences and spiritual crises, contributing to the growth of a more sophisticated understanding of contemplative practice and mystical theology. The techniques she had pioneered in Strasbourg were taught to other religious communities and eventually influenced the development of spiritual direction and pastoral counseling practices that are still used today. Her integration of physical movement with contemplative prayer also contributed to traditions of sacred dance and movement meditation that continue to flourish in various religious communities. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the dancing plague was its demonstration of the human capacity for transcendence and transformation. Even under the most unusual and challenging circumstances, the phenomenon showed that ordinary people, merchants and craftsmen, housewives and servants, were capable of responding to spiritual calls that lifted them beyond the limitations of their everyday lives. The dancers had heard music that existed beyond the range of normal human perception, and they had found the courage to follow where that music led, even when it required them to abandon social conventions and personal comfort. Their willingness to surrender to forces greater than themselves had opened pathways to experiences of beauty and meaning that would otherwise have remained closed to them. In our own time, when the pace of life often seems to leave little room for wonder or transcendence, the story of the Strasbourg dancers reminds us that the capacity for mystical experience remains alive within human nature. We may not hear the cosmic music that compelled Frau Troffea to begin her solitary dance, but we retain the ability to recognize beauty when it calls to us, and to find the courage to follow where it leads. The dancing plague also reminds us of the importance of community in navigating experiences that transcend normal understanding. The dancers found strength and support in their shared response to the mystery that had claimed them, and their collective movement created something more beautiful and meaningful than any individual performance could have achieved. Perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates that apparent chaos and disruption can sometimes be the beginning of profound healing and transformation. What seemed like a plague was actually a kind of collective spiritual awakening, a community-wide response to forces that called people toward deeper levels of meaning and connection. The narrow streets of Strasbourg are quiet now, their cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of ordinary footsteps rather than mystical dancing. But on summer evenings, when the light slants golden across the old buildings, visitors sometimes report hearing faint echoes of music that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The ghostly remnant of the cosmic symphony that once compelled hundreds of people to dance in perfect harmony with forces beyond understanding. And in that gentle echo, we find the lasting gift of the dancing plague, the reminder that we live in a world shot through with mystery and beauty, where the ordinary and extraordinary interweave in patterns too complex for our minds to fully grasp. We may not all be called to dance in the streets, but we can all learn to listen for the music that underlies existence, to remain open to the possibility of transcendence, and to find the courage to follow wherever beauty leads us. The dancers of Strasbourg found their rest at last in the silence that completed their cosmic symphony. But their example continues to move through the world like music itself, inspiring others to listen for the deeper rhythms that connect all things, to trust in the wisdom of forces greater than themselves, and to remember that even the most ordinary life can become a dance of extraordinary grace when we learn to hear the music that calls us home to our truest selves. But our story of the dancing plague does not end with the winter solstice of 1518, for the ripples created by that extraordinary summer continued to spread outward like circles on still water, touching lives and shaping understanding in ways that the original participants could never have imagined. The phenomenon had revealed something profound about the human capacity for collective transcendence, and that revelation would resonate through the centuries in forms both subtle and profound. In the years immediately following the dancing plague, Strasbourg became a destination for scholars, physicians, and theologians from across Europe who sought to understand what they had heard described as the most remarkable spiritual phenomenon of their age. The city's authorities, initially reluctant to draw attention to what they had considered an embarrassing episode, gradually came to recognize the international significance of what had occurred within their walls. Dr. Johannes Trithemius, the renowned Benedictine abbot and scholar, arrived in Strasbourg in the spring of 1519, just months after the last dancers had found their rest. Trithemius was known throughout Europe for his studies of mystical theology and his investigations into what he called supernatural natural phenomena, events that seemed to transcend ordinary understanding while still operating within the created order. Trithemius spent several months in Strasbourg, interviewing former dancers, examining the locations where the phenomenon had occurred, and studying the detailed records that city officials and medical observers had kept throughout the crisis. His investigation was methodical and thorough, reflecting both his scholarly training and his deep respect for the spiritual dimensions of human experience. What Trithemius discovered challenged many of the assumptions that learned men had held about mass spiritual phenomena. Unlike the cases of religious hysteria that had been recorded in various monasteries and convents, the dancing plague had affected people from all walks of life. Unlike typical outbreaks of collective possession or spiritual enthusiasm, it had been characterized by beauty rather than violence, harmony rather than chaos. This was not madness, Trithemius wrote in his extensive report to the Holy Roman Emperor, but rather a kind of collective revelation, a community-wide opening to spiritual forces that normally remain hidden from human perception. The dancers were not possessed by demons, but rather touched by some aspect of divine beauty that compelled their bodies to respond in the only way available to them. Trithemius's investigation revealed that many former dancers had experienced lasting positive changes in their lives. They reported enhanced spiritual sensitivity, deeper capacity for prayer and contemplation, and an abiding sense of having participated in something sacred and transformative. Some had chosen to dedicate their lives more fully to religious service, while others had found ways to integrate their mystical experiences into their secular occupations. Most remarkably, Trithemius found that the former dancers had developed what he described as sympathetic connections with one another that persisted long after the dancing had ended. They seemed able to sense each other's spiritual and emotional states across great distances, and they naturally gathered together for prayer and contemplation, as if their shared experience had created permanent bonds that transcended normal social relationships. They have become a kind of spiritual community, Trithemius observed, bound together not by vows or regulations, but by their common participation in a mystery that transformed their very nature. They represent something new in Christian experience, a form of mystical fellowship that emerged spontaneously from divine grace rather than human planning. This observation proved to be prophetic. Over the years following the dancing plague, the former dancers did indeed develop into an informal religious community that met regularly for prayer, contemplation, and mutual support. They called themselves simply the Friends. And while they remained active in their secular occupations, they created a parallel spiritual life that drew on the extraordinary experiences they had shared. Under the guidance of Sister Adelheid, who had remained in Strasbourg after successfully treating the dancers, the Friends developed distinctive practices of contemplative prayer that incorporated movement and rhythm. These practices, which they called silent dancing, allowed them to return to the spiritual states they had experienced during the plague, but in a controlled and balanced way that enhanced rather than disrupted their daily lives. The silent dancing practices attracted attention from religious communities throughout the region. Monks and nuns came to learn from the Friends, seeking to understand how laypeople had achieved such profound levels of mystical experience. The techniques that Sister Adelheid and the former dancers developed were gradually incorporated into various religious traditions, contributing to a renewal of contemplative spirituality throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Brother Marcus of Einsiedeln, a Benedictine monk who spent a year studying with the Friends in 1522, wrote in his journal, "These simple people have discovered something that our centuries of theological study had not revealed to us, that the body itself can become a pathway to divine union, that movement and rhythm can open doors to spiritual realms that remain closed to purely intellectual approaches. They dance their way to God with a directness and immediacy that humbles all our scholarly pretensions." Influence of the Strasbourg Friends extended beyond religious circles to affect the broader cultural and intellectual life of the region. Humanist scholars found in their story evidence for the Renaissance ideal of human dignity and potential. The dancing plague demonstrated that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary spiritual achievements, that divine grace was not limited to officially recognized saints and mystics. Erasmus of Rotterdam, who visited Strasbourg in 1524, was particularly struck by the integration of mystical experience with practical life that he observed among the former dancers. They have solved a problem that has vexed Christian thinkers for centuries: how to live simultaneously in the world and beyond it, how to serve both earthly responsibilities and heavenly callings. Their dancing taught them to find the sacred within the ordinary, the eternal within the temporal. The artistic community was equally influenced by the story of the dancing plague. Painters began to depict scenes of collective spiritual ecstasy that drew inspiration from descriptions of the Strasbourg phenomenon. Musicians composed works that attempted to capture the rhythm and beauty of the unheard music that had compelled the dancers. Poets wrote verses that explored themes of divine compulsion and mystical surrender. Albrecht Dürer, the great German artist, created a series of engravings in 1525 that he titled The Heavenly Dance. The works depicted figures in flowing robes moving in perfect harmony across landscapes that seemed to exist somewhere between earth and heaven. Dürer wrote that he had been inspired by the wondrous account of the Strasbourg dancers, who showed us that even our earthly bodies can become instruments of celestial music. Influence of the dancing plague was also felt in the development of medical and psychological understanding. Physicians who had observed the phenomenon began to develop new theories about the relationship between physical and spiritual health, between individual and collective consciousness, and between normal and extraordinary states of human awareness. Paracelsus incorporated his observations of the Strasbourg dancers into his revolutionary medical theories. He argued that the human body was far more sensitive to spiritual and cosmic influences than conventional medicine recognized, and that many diseases might be understood as disruptions in the flow of spiritual energy through physical systems. Dancers of Strasbourg were not ill, Paracelsus wrote, but rather supremely healthy in ways that our medical training does not teach us to recognize. They had achieved a harmony between body and soul that made them sensitive to forces that normally remain beyond human perception. Paracelsus's theories, influenced by his study of the dancing plague, contributed to the development of holistic approaches to medicine that considered spiritual as well as physical factors in health and disease. These approaches would eventually influence the development of psychosomatic medicine and various forms of alternative healing that remain popular today. The theological implications of the dancing plague were equally far-reaching. The phenomenon challenged conventional distinctions between natural and supernatural events, between individual and collective religious experience, and between orthodox and heterodox forms of spirituality. Cardinal Albrecht of Brandenburg, one of the most influential church leaders of his time, commissioned a detailed theological investigation of the Strasbourg phenomenon in 1526. The investigation was led by Dr. Johann Eck, a renowned theologian and professor at the University of Ingolstadt. Dr. Eck's investigation lasted for 2 years and involved extensive interviews with former dancers, examination of written records, and consultation with theological experts from across Europe. His final report, published in 1528, concluded that the dancing plague had been a genuine manifestation of divine grace, the one that operated through natural rather than miraculous means. God works through the created order, Dr. Eck wrote, and what occurred in Strasbourg was not a suspension of natural law, but rather a revelation of hidden aspects of that law. The dancers experienced divine influence through their created nature, not despite it. This conclusion was significant because it provided official church approval for the phenomenon while maintaining theological orthodoxy. It suggested that mystical experiences, like the dancing plague, were part of God's normal way of working in the world, rather than rare exceptions that required miraculous intervention. Dr. X's report also emphasized the collective nature of the Strasbourg phenomenon, arguing that it demonstrated God's desire to work through communities rather than only through isolated individuals. The dancers showed us that divine grace can descend upon entire communities, that the Holy Spirit can move through groups of people in ways that transform not only individuals, but the social bonds that connect them. This has profound implications for our understanding of the Church as the body of Christ. These theological insights contributed to the development of more communal and participatory forms of Christian worship. Churches throughout the region began to experiment with practices that encouraged collective spiritual experience, drawing inspiration from the Strasbourg model while maintaining connection to traditional forms of worship. The long-term social and economic impacts of the dancing plague were equally significant. The phenomenon had demonstrated the importance of community support during times of crisis, and the successful resolution of the crisis had shown the value of seeking wisdom from unconventional sources. The city of Strasbourg itself was transformed by the experience. The authorities had learned to respond to unusual situations with creativity and flexibility, rather than rigid adherence to established procedures. They had also discovered the value of consulting with various experts and stakeholders, rather than relying solely on official authority. These lessons proved valuable during the religious and political upheavals that characterized the 16th century, when the Protestant Reformation reached Strasbourg in the 1520s. The city was able to navigate the transition with relatively little conflict, drawing on the skills they had developed in managing the dancing plague crisis. The economic impacts were also lasting. The international attention that the dancing plague had brought to Strasbourg proved beneficial to trade and commerce, as merchants and scholars from across Europe became familiar with the city. The reputation for wisdom and learning that Strasbourg had gained through its handling of the crisis attracted new residents and investments that contributed to the city's continued prosperity. Most importantly, the dancing plague had created a legacy of openness to spiritual experience and mystical wisdom that continued to influence the character of the city for generations. Strasbourg became known as a place where unusual spiritual phenomena were met with understanding rather than persecution, where seekers of mystical wisdom could find support and guidance. This reputation attracted various religious reform movements and mystical communities over the years. The city became a center for the development of what historians now call practical mysticism, approaches to spiritual life that integrated contemplative practice with active engagement in the world. The Strasbourg Friends continued to meet and practice their silent dancing well into the 17th century, with new members joining as they were drawn to the community's unique combination of mystical depth and practical wisdom. The practices they developed were eventually formalized into a spiritual tradition that influenced various Protestant denominations and continues to exist in modified forms today. As the 16th century progressed and religious conflicts intensified throughout Europe, the story of the Strasbourg dancing plague took on new significance as a symbol of peaceful resolution and spiritual unity. At a time when Christians were increasingly divided by theological disputes and political conflicts, the memory of hundreds of people dancing together in perfect harmony provided a powerful image of what religious community could become. Father Thomas More, not to be confused with the English saint, a Jesuit missionary who visited Strasbourg in 1580, wrote in his report to his superiors, "The legacy of the dancing plague continues to shape this city in remarkable ways. Despite the religious divisions that have torn apart so many communities, the people here have maintained an unusual capacity for cooperation and mutual understanding. They seem to remember, perhaps unconsciously, the lesson learned during that extraordinary summer, that we are all part of one great dance, all responding to the same divine music, even when we cannot hear it clearly." This observation was echoed by many other visitors to Strasbourg during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The city maintained a reputation for religious tolerance and intellectual openness that was rare in that age of religious warfare and persecution. The University of Strasbourg, founded in 1621, was established partly in recognition of the city's unique intellectual and spiritual heritage. The university's motto, Harmonis Progressus, harmonious progress, was said to have been inspired by the memory of the dancing plague and the vision of human community that it had represented. The university became a center for the study of what we would now call comparative religion and mystical theology. Scholars came from across Europe to study the phenomenon of collective spiritual experience, using the Strasbourg dancing plague as their primary case study. The university's library accumulated one of the world's most comprehensive collections of documents related to mystical phenomena and altered states of consciousness. Dr. Johann Arndt, who held the university's first chair in mystical theology, established a research program in 1625 that systematically studied accounts of mass spiritual phenomena from across Europe and the broader Christian world. His work revealed that the Strasbourg dancing plague was part of a larger pattern of collective mystical experiences that had occurred throughout Christian history, though rarely with such positive outcomes. The dancing plague of Strasbourg represents the ideal toward which all collective spiritual phenomena naturally tend. Dr. Arndt wrote in his masterwork, The Harmony of Souls. It shows us what can happen when communities open themselves to divine influence while maintaining the structures of mutual support and wise guidance that allow such experiences to reach their proper completion. Dr. Arndt's research identified key factors that had contributed to the positive resolution of the Strasbourg phenomenon. The community's willingness to seek help from multiple sources, presence of wise spiritual guides like Sister Adelheid, and the maintenance of care and support for those experiencing the mystical states. These factors became the basis for protocols that were used to manage similar phenomena when they occurred in other locations. The influence of the Strasbourg model extended beyond Christian communities to affect Jewish and Islamic mystical traditions as well. Rabbi Isaac Luria, the great Kabbalist, is known to have studied accounts of the dancing plague and to have incorporated insights from them into his understanding of collective spiritual elevation. Similarly, Sufi masters in the Ottoman Empire wrote commentaries on the Strasbourg phenomenon, seeing in it confirmation of their own teachings about the power of communal spiritual practice. The artistic legacy of the dancing plague continued to evolve throughout the 17th century. The Baroque period, with its emphasis on dramatic spiritual expression and elaborate artistic synthesis, found particular inspiration in the story of the Strasbourg dancers. Johann Sebastian Bach, who visited Strasbourg in 1714, was deeply moved by the stories he heard about the dancing plague and the ongoing practices of the Friends community. He composed a series of 6 cantatas, known collectively as the Strasbourg cycle, that attempted to capture in music the progression from compulsive movement to peaceful rest that had characterized the original phenomenon. Bach wrote in his notes for the cantatas, "I have sought to compose the unheard music that moved the dancers of Strasbourg, to make audible the celestial harmonies that compelled their earthly steps. Though I cannot reproduce the exact melodies that existed in their hearts, I pray that these compositions may awaken in listeners something of the same longing for divine union that moved those blessed souls to dance." Strasbourg cycle is now recognized as one of Bach's most innovative works, remarkable for its integration of complex musical structures with deeply personal spiritual expression. The cantatas were written to be performed by large choirs and orchestras, reflecting Bach's understanding that the original phenomenon had been fundamentally communal in nature. The visual arts continued to find inspiration in the dancing plague as well. Peter Paul Rubens created a series of paintings in the 1620s depicting various scenes from the Strasbourg story. His works emphasized the beauty and harmony of the collective dancing, showing figures in flowing garments moving in perfect synchronization across landscapes that seemed to glow with divine light. Rubens wrote that he had been particularly inspired by accounts of how the dancers had never collided with one another, despite their large numbers and complex movements. This detail reveals the presence of some guiding intelligence that operated beyond the conscious awareness of the individual dancers. They moved not merely as separate persons following the same rhythm, but as organs of a single body responding to a unified will. Literary response to the dancing plague was equally rich and varied. Writers throughout the 17th and 18th centuries found in the story themes that resonated with their own concerns about individual identity, social harmony, and spiritual transcendence. The German poet Andreas Gryphius wrote a long narrative poem called Das Tanzwunder, the Dance Wonder, in 1648, just as the 30 Years' War was coming to an end. Gryphius used the story of the Strasbourg dancers as a vision of what human community could become when people learned to move together in harmony rather than fighting against each other. The poem's conclusion became famous throughout the German-speaking world. So let us learn from those who danced in Strasbourg's ancient street, who found in motion's mystery a way to make love complete. Though wars may rage and kingdoms fall, though hatred fill the air, the music of eternal peace is sounding everywhere. These lines were often quoted during the difficult period of Reconstruction that followed the war, offering hope that the human capacity for harmony and cooperation could overcome even the most devastating conflicts. The influence of the dancing plague story extended beyond Europe, as European colonization and missionary activity carried it to other parts of the world. Jesuit missionaries in China wrote detailed accounts of the Strasbourg phenomenon for their Chinese colleagues, drawing parallels between the Christian mystical experience and various Taoist and Buddhist practices involving movement and altered consciousness. Father Matteo Ricci, in his famous work, The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, included a chapter on the dancing plague as evidence that Christian mystical experience could take forms that would be familiar to practitioners of Eastern spiritual traditions. This cross-cultural comparison helped Ricci make Christianity more accessible to Chinese intellectuals, while also expanding European understanding of the universal nature of mystical experience. Similar comparative work was done by missionaries in India, where the story of the Strasbourg dancers was compared to various Hindu and Sufi traditions of sacred dance. These comparisons contributed to the development of what scholars now call comparative mysticism, the systematic study of similarities and differences in mystical experience across different religious traditions. The scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries also engaged with the legacy of the dancing plague, as natural philosophers sought to understand the phenomenon using new methods of empirical investigation and rational analysis. Sir Isaac Newton, in his later years, became fascinated by accounts of the Strasbourg phenomenon and attempted to develop mathematical models that could explain how large numbers of people might synchronize their movements without conscious coordination. His work on this problem contributed to his broader investigations of harmonic motion and wave propagation. Newton wrote in his unpublished notebooks, "The dancers of Strasbourg achieved a form of physical harmony that mirrors the mathematical harmonies that govern the motion of celestial bodies. Their synchronization suggests the operation of forces that connect individual human beings in ways analogous to the gravitational forces that bind the planets in their orbits." This line of thinking influenced Newton's development of theories about action at a distance, and contributed to his understanding of how forces could operate across space to create coordinated motion in separated objects. The philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was equally intrigued by the implications of the dancing plague for his theories of monadic harmony and pre-established coordination. Leibniz saw in the Strasbourg phenomenon evidence for his theory that the universe consisted of independent spiritual substances that appeared to interact only because they had been programmed by God to develop in perfect synchronization. The dancers followed rhythms that existed in their individual souls, Leibniz wrote. But those rhythms had been established by divine wisdom to create the appearance of collective harmony. They were like clocks that had been set to the same time, each keeping perfect rhythm independently while creating the illusion of mutual influence. These philosophical and scientific engagements with the dancing plague story contributed to broader developments in European thought about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between individual and collective behavior, and the role of spiritual factors in physical phenomena. The Enlightenment period brought new approaches to understanding the dancing plague, as rationalist thinkers sought to explain the phenomenon using the emerging methods of empirical psychology and social science. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, analyzed the dancing plague as an example of what he called sympathetic communication of emotions, the process by which feelings and behaviors could spread from person to person without conscious intention or rational decision-making. Hume's analysis, published in his treatise on human nature, argued that the Strasbourg phenomenon demonstrated the power of imitation and emotional contagion in human social behavior. The first dancer established a pattern of behavior that others found compelling, not because they understood its meaning, but because they felt its emotional resonance. The phenomenon spread through the community like ripples on a pond, with each new participant adding to the force that drew others into the dance. This psychological interpretation of the dancing plague influenced the development of early social psychology and contributed to growing understanding of how collective behaviors could emerge from individual psychological processes. The French philosopher Voltaire took a different approach, seeing in the Strasbourg story evidence for the importance of religious tolerance and the dangers of dogmatic thinking. Voltaire argued that the positive resolution of the dancing plague had been possible only because the Strasbourg authorities had remained open to unconventional solutions and had resisted the temptation to suppress what they didn't understand. Wisdom shown by the magistrates of Strasbourg, Voltaire wrote in his philosophical dictionary, stands as a model for how civil authorities should respond to unusual religious phenomena by seeking understanding rather than imposing control, by consulting wise advisors rather than relying on prejudice. They achieved a resolution that honored both social order and spiritual freedom. Voltaire's interpretation of the dancing plague became part of his broader argument for religious tolerance and rational governance, contributing to the intellectual foundation of modern liberal democracy. The Romantic period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought yet another wave of interest in the Strasbourg dancing plague, as romantic writers and artists found in the story themes that resonated with their celebration of emotion, intuition, and transcendent experience. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote extensively about the dancing plague in his later years, seeing in it an example of what he called elective affinity, the mysterious force that drew certain people together in spiritual and emotional communion. Goethe's novel Elective Affinities was partly inspired by his study of the Strasbourg phenomenon and his fascination with the bonds that had connected the dancers across time and space. Dancers of Strasbourg discovered something that our age of reason has forgotten. Goethe wrote in a letter to his friend Johann Peter Eckermann that human beings are connected to each other and to the cosmos by forces that transcend rational understanding. Their dancing was a form of prayer, a physical expression of their participation in the universal harmony. Romantic composer Ludwig van Beethoven was equally influenced by the story of the dancing plague. His Ninth Symphony, with its famous Ode to Joy, finale celebrating universal human brotherhood, was inspired partly by his reading of accounts of the Strasbourg phenomenon. Beethoven saw in the dancer's story a vision of humanity united not by political ideology or social convention, but by shared participation in something transcendent and beautiful. Beethoven wrote to a friend, "The dancers of Strasbourg achieved what I seek to create in my music, a moment when individual voices join together in perfect harmony to express something that none could express alone. Their bodies became instruments in a cosmic orchestra, playing melodies that existed only in the realm of pure spirit." Influence of the dancing plague story continued to spread throughout the 19th century as improved transportation and communication made it easier for information to travel across national boundaries. The story was translated into dozens of languages and became part of the folklore and intellectual heritage of communities far from Strasbourg. In Russia, the story was embraced by various mystical and philosophical movements that sought alternatives to both Orthodox Christianity and Western rationalism. Leo Tolstoy wrote extensively about the Strasbourg dancers in his later religious writings, seeing in their story evidence for his belief that true spirituality emerged from the hearts of common people rather than from institutional authority. Peasants and craftsmen of Strasbourg achieved a higher form of religious understanding than all the theologians and bishops of their time. Tolstoy wrote in The Kingdom of God is Within You. Their dancing expressed truths about the nature of divine love that no amount of scholarly study could reveal. Tolstoy's interpretation of the dancing plague influenced his development of Christian anarchism and his advocacy for nonviolent resistance to political oppression. He saw in the dancers willing surrender to forces greater than themselves a model for how individuals could transcend the ego-driven conflicts that created social injustice and political violence. The story also found resonance in American transcendentalist circles, where writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau saw in the Strasbourg phenomenon confirmation of their belief in the inherent spirituality of nature and human experience. Emerson wrote in his journal, "The dancers of Strasbourg remind us that the divine spirit moves through the material world, seeking expression in forms that our limited understanding cannot always comprehend. They teach us to remain open to mystery, to trust in forces that transcend rational analysis, to find the sacred in the most unexpected places." This transcendentalist interpretation of the dancing plague contributed to the development of American spiritual movements that emphasized personal experience over institutional doctrine, direct communion with nature over mediated religious practice. As the 19th century progressed and the scientific study of psychology began to emerge as a distinct discipline, researchers developed new approaches to understanding the dancing plague and similar phenomena. The work of pioneering psychologists like William James and Carl Jung brought sophisticated theoretical frameworks to bear on the mystery of collective spiritual experience. William James, in his groundbreaking work, The Varieties of Religious Experience, devoted an entire chapter to analysis of the Strasbourg dancing plague. James argued that the phenomenon represented a particularly pure form of what he called mystical experience, a direct encounter with spiritual reality that transcended ordinary consciousness. Dancers of Strasbourg achieved a form of religious experience that was both intensely personal and profoundly communal. James wrote, "They discovered that the barriers between individual consciousness could dissolve without destroying personal identity, that people could unite in spiritual communion while remaining distinct individuals." James's psychological analysis of the dancing plague influenced his development of pragmatic philosophy and his understanding of how religious beliefs functioned in human life. He saw in the Strasbourg story evidence that spiritual experiences, regardless of their ultimate metaphysical status, could have profound positive effects on individual well-being and social cooperation. Carl Jung's engagement with the dancing plague story was even more extensive and influential. Jung saw in the phenomenon an example of what he would later call synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that suggested the existence of patterns connecting psychological and physical events. Jung was particularly fascinated by the timing of the dancing plague and its relationship to broader social and psychological conditions in early 16th century Europe. He argued that the phenomenon represented a collective breakthrough of unconscious spiritual energies that had been suppressed by the increasing rationalization and institutionalization of religious life. Dancers of Strasbourg were responding to collective need for spiritual authenticity. Jung wrote in his essay, "The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man." Their dancing was a form of compensation, a way for the community's unconscious wisdom to express itself when conscious religious institutions had become too rigid and intellectual. Jung's analysis of the dancing plague contributed to his development of theories about the collective unconscious and archetypal patterns in human behavior. He saw in the story evidence for his belief that human beings shared deep psychological structures that could manifest in similar ways across different cultures and historical periods. The influence of Jungian psychology on 20th century understanding of the dancing plague was profound and lasting. Scholars in fields ranging from anthropology to religious studies to social psychology drew on Jung's insights to develop new approaches to studying collective spiritual phenomena. The 20th century brought both new challenges and new opportunities for understanding the legacy of the dancing plague. 2 world wars and various social upheavals created conditions that made the story of peaceful spiritual community particularly relevant and poignant. During World War I, various peace movements drew inspiration from the memory of the Strasbourg dancers, seeing in their story a vision of human unity that transcended national and ethnic divisions. The fact that the original dancers had come from different social classes and ethnic backgrounds. Strasbourg was a multicultural city even in the 16th century, made their story particularly powerful as a symbol of human brotherhood. The Quaker humanitarian Rufus Jones wrote during the war, "The dancers of Strasbourg achieved in one summer what we have failed to achieve in centuries of civilization. They learned to move together in perfect harmony, to respond as one body to the rhythms of divine love. If we could rediscover their secret, perhaps we too could learn to dance together instead of marching against each other." This pacifist interpretation of the dancing plague influenced various anti-war movements and contributed to the development of nonviolent resistance techniques that would later be used by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. The period between the 2 world wars saw renewed scholarly interest in the dancing plague, as historians and social scientists sought to understand how communities could maintain coherence and purpose during times of rapid social change. The story of how Strasbourg had successfully managed an unprecedented crisis seemed particularly relevant as European societies struggled with economic depression and political instability. The rise of fascism in the 1930s gave new urgency to questions about collective behavior and mass psychology. Some scholars worried that phenomena like the dancing plague might be co-opted by totalitarian movements seeking to manipulate popular emotions for political ends. However, most researchers concluded that the Strasbourg phenomenon was fundamentally different from the mass movements that characterized fascist politics. The dancing plague had been characterized by spontaneous emergence rather than organized manipulation, by spiritual seeking rather than political ideology, by inclusive community rather than exclusionary nationalism. Dr. Hannah Arendt, in her analysis of totalitarian movements, specifically contrasted the dancing plague with fascist rallies. The dancers of Strasbourg were united by their common response to transcendent beauty, while totalitarian movements unite their followers through shared hatred and fear. The dancers remained individuals even in their collective ecstasy, while totalitarian movements seek to destroy individual identity in favor of mass conformity. This distinction became important in post-war efforts to understand how healthy forms of collective identity could be distinguished from pathological mass movements. The Second World War and its aftermath brought new dimensions to the interpretation of the dancing plague story. The horrors of the Holocaust and other genocides made the vision of peaceful religious community embodied in the Strasbourg story seem both more precious and more fragile. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had survived the Nazi persecution of European Jewry, found in the story of the dancing plague a vision of what religious community could become when it was guided by divine love rather than human hatred. The dancers of Strasbourg show us that religion at its best creates harmony rather than division, that true spiritual experience leads to greater love for all of God's children rather than to exclusion and persecution. Heschel's interpretation of the dancing plague influenced the development of interfaith dialogue and contributed to growing recognition that mystical experience could serve as a bridge between different religious traditions. The civil rights movement in the United States also found inspiration in the story of the Strasbourg dancers. The fact that the original phenomenon had transcended social and economic divisions made it a powerful symbol for movements seeking to overcome racial prejudice and social inequality. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. referenced the dancing plague in several of his sermons, seeing in the story a vision of the beloved community that he sought to create through nonviolent social change. The dancers of Strasbourg achieved something we are still struggling to accomplish. They learned to move together as equals, to respond to the same divine call regardless of their earthly differences. Their dance was a prophecy of the integrated society we seek to build. This interpretation of the dancing plague contributed to the development of civil rights theology and influenced various liberation movements around the world. The counterculture movements of the 1960s brought yet another wave of interest in the Strasbourg dancing plague, as young people sought alternatives to what they perceived as the rigid conformity and spiritual emptiness of mainstream society. The story of ordinary people spontaneously breaking into ecstatic dance seemed to anticipate many of the themes that would characterize the hippie movement, and its emphasis on peace, love, and spiritual exploration. The famous Woodstock Music Festival of 1969 was explicitly compared by some participants to the dancing plague of Strasbourg, with commentators noting similarities between the two events. Large numbers of people gathering spontaneously, collective experiences of transcendent music, temporary creation of alternative communities based on shared spiritual values. However, scholars who studied both phenomena noted important differences as well. The Strasbourg dancers had achieved their unity through surrender to something beyond themselves, while the counterculture movements tended to emphasize individual self-expression and personal liberation. Dr. Theodor Roszak, in his influential book, The Making of a Counterculture, wrote, "The dancers of Strasbourg achieved genuine transcendence through self-surrender, while our contemporary seekers often confuse self-indulgence with spiritual liberation. The medieval phenomenon points toward possibilities for collective spiritual experience that we have not yet learned to realize." This critique influenced the development of more disciplined approaches to spiritual practice within the counterculture, contributing to the growth of interest in meditation, yoga, and other contemplative disciplines. The New Age movement that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s drew extensively on the story of the dancing plague, seeing in it confirmation of beliefs about the coming transformation of human consciousness and the emergence of new forms of spiritual community. New Age writers interpreted the Strasbourg phenomenon as evidence that human beings were capable of dramatic spiritual evolution, that ordinary people could achieve states of consciousness that transcended normal limitations of time and space. Shirley MacLaine, in her best-selling book, Out on a Limb, wrote, "The dancers of Strasbourg were precursors of the consciousness revolution that is transforming our world today. They showed us that we are all connected at levels deeper than we normally realize, that we can achieve collective enlightenment when we learn to tune into the cosmic frequencies that surround us." New Age interpretation of the dancing plague contributed to the development of various movement therapies, consciousness expanding techniques, and community building practices that remain popular today. The late 20th century also saw significant advances in the scientific understanding of phenomena related to the dancing plague. Research in neuroscience, psychology, and anthropology provided new insights into how collective behaviors emerge and how altered states of consciousness can be achieved through rhythmic movement and group activities. Dr. Arthur Dakeman's research on meditation and altered states of consciousness shed light on the neurological mechanisms that might have been involved in the dancing plague. Dakeman's work suggested that rhythmic movement, especially when performed in groups, could induce changes in brain chemistry that led to feelings of transcendence and unity. Dancers of Strasbourg may have stumbled upon one of the most effective techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness. Dakeman wrote, "Rhythmic movement, especially when synchronized with others, can trigger the release of endorphins and other neurochemicals that create feelings of euphoria and spiritual connection." This scientific perspective on the dancing plague didn't diminish its spiritual significance, but rather provided additional insights into how spiritual experiences might be grounded in the normal functioning of the human brain and body. Sleep peacefully, dear listeners, knowing that the same cosmic music that moved the dancers of Strasbourg continues to flow through the world around us, waiting for those with ears to hear and hearts brave enough to follow where it leads. And in your dreams, perhaps you too will hear that ancient melody and feel your own feet begin to move in harmony with the eternal rhythm that connects all souls in one vast, beautiful, never-ending dance.